You probably know Elon Musk. You know Jeff Bezos. You know Mark Zuckerberg. Their wealth is almost impossible to ignore. But here's the strange part. Some of the richest people on Earth rarely appear in your news feed. They don't need to. They don't build their fortunes around personal brands. They don't constantly post online. And sometimes you may have never even heard their names. Behind supermarkets, food companies, industrial giants, insurance businesses, private investment firms, and everyday products are families controlling fortunes worth tens of billions of dollars. And some of these fortunes are so large that they rival the wealth of famous technology billionaires. In 2026, Forbes estimated that America's 54 richest families collectively controlled about $1.9 trillion. The Walton family alone was estimated at roughly $520 billion. Forbes. So why don't we hear about them? Because the biggest fortunes don't always come from becoming famous. Sometimes they come from owning something people use every day, without knowing who owns it. And once you understand how these fortunes were built, you'll see wealth very differently. Level 1. The billionaires hiding in plain sight. Imagine walking into a supermarket. You buy groceries, maybe some candy, pet food, paper towels. You probably don't think about the families behind those products, but that's exactly where the hidden wealth begins. Take the Mars family. You know M&Ms. You know Snickers. You probably know Milky Way. But the family behind the company is nowhere near as famous as the products. Mars remains privately owned. And in 2026, Forbes estimated the company's value at around $121 billion. Forbes. The family didn't need to build a social media empire. They built something much more powerful, a machine that repeatedly converts everyday purchases into cash flow. And then they kept ownership. That last part matters, because there is a huge difference between earning money and owning an asset that earns money. A CEO might make millions. A founder might sell a company for billions, but an owner can potentially keep collecting value from the same asset for decades. That's the first secret of hidden wealth. Ownership beats attention. Level 2. The families behind businesses you already use. Now consider Koch. Most people know the name only vaguely, but Koch is enormous. The company operates across industries including chemicals, energy, manufacturing, technology, and other businesses. And because it is privately controlled, its scale can be harder for ordinary consumers to see. Forbes estimated Koch at about $185 billion in enterprise value in its 2026 ranking of America's most valuable private family businesses. Forbes. Then there's Cargill. You've probably never seen a Cargill billboard. You probably don't follow Cargill on social media, but the company sits deep inside the global food and agriculture system. It trades commodities. It handles agriculture. It operates logistics and risk management businesses. And Forbes estimates that more than 100 members of the Cargill and Macmillan families collectively own about 88% of the company. Forbes. That is a completely different kind of wealth. You don't need millions of customers to know your name. You need millions of customers to unknowingly depend on your business. Think about that. The most powerful company isn't always the one you see. Sometimes it's the one operating several layers behind everything you see. Level 3. The real superpower is staying private. Here's where things get interesting. Public companies have shareholders. They publish financial statements. Analysts watch them. Journalists track executives. Investors react to every major announcement. Private companies can operate differently. They still face regulations and financial realities, but they don't have the same obligation to constantly satisfy public market investors. And for wealthy families, that can create something extremely valuable. Time. They can think in decades, not quarters. Look at Fidelity. You probably know the company, but the Johnson family behind it is far less famous than the technology billionaires dominating headlines. Forbes estimates the Johnson family still owns about 49% of Fidelity, while employees own the remainder. The company was valued at approximately $107 billion in Forbes' 2026 Private Family Business Ranking. Forbes. The Johnson fortune wasn't built from one viral startup. It was built through financial infrastructure. And financial infrastructure is powerful because money itself passes through it. That leads to another lesson. The richest businesses aren't always selling products. Sometimes they're selling access, infrastructure, distribution, financial services, or the systems that allow other businesses to operate. Level 4. The wealth nobody sees on a Forbes profile. But there is an even deeper reason some fortunes remain invisible. A person's wealth isn't always sitting inside their bank account. It can be spread across companies, holding structures, trusts, real estate, private investments, stocks, foundations, and family offices. This creates a completely different relationship with money. Imagine earning $10 million. You are rich. Now imagine owning an asset worth $1 billion that produces income year after year. That's something else entirely. And now imagine your children inherit part of it. Then their children inherit part of it. The fortune can become less about an individual and more about a financial ecosystem. The Walton family is perhaps the clearest modern example. In 2026, Forbes estimated the family's combined fortune at roughly $520 billion, largely because of their ownership of Walmart. Forbes. But here's the fascinating part. The individual heirs don't necessarily need to run Walmart every day. They can own the asset creates value, and generations can inherit that ownership. This is why wealth compounds differently from income. If you work for money, you usually exchange time for it. If you own productive assets, the assets can work without requiring your physical presence every hour. That is the difference between being highly paid and being wealthy. Level 5. The Hidden Wealth Blueprint. So what can ordinary people actually learn from these families? Not that everyone should build a multinational corporation. That's unrealistic. The lesson is much simpler. Wealth is usually created through ownership. Look at the pattern. The Mars family kept ownership. The Koch family maintained control. The Cargill and Macmillan families retained a huge stake in their company. The Johnson family retained ownership of Fidelity. The Walton heirs retained ownership of Walmart. Different industries, different generations, different strategies. But the same underlying principle, they owned productive assets, and they protected that ownership. This is why selling everything for a quick payday can sometimes be less powerful than maintaining a stake in something that continues growing. And it's also why entrepreneurs sometimes become dramatically wealthier after their company grows, even if their salary hasn't changed much. Their ownership stake increased in value. That's the hidden engine, not income, equity. But there is another lesson. These families also understood something most people underestimate. Boring businesses can create extraordinary wealth. You don't need to invent the next social network. You might build a distribution company, a logistics business, a manufacturing company, a financial services firm, a food company, a construction materials business, something ordinary that millions of people depend on. Forbes' 2026 ranking of private family businesses is filled with exactly these kinds of companies: Koch, Mars, Cargill, Reyes Holdings, Quikrete, Estes Express Lines, Enterprise Mobility, Forbes. None sounds particularly glamorous. That's the point. The world doesn't pay you extra because your business looks exciting. It pays you when your business solves a valuable problem at scale. Conclusion. The wealthiest people aren't always the most famous. We live in a world obsessed with visible wealth: luxury cars, private jets, mansions, watches, celebrity billionaires. But visible wealth is only one layer of the story. The deeper layer is ownership. Who owns the company? Who owns the land? Who owns the shares? Who controls the distribution network? Who owns the infrastructure? Who keeps the profits? And perhaps, most importantly, who still owns it 30 years later? Because the richest person in the room isn't necessarily the person wearing the most expensive watch. It might be the person nobody recognizes, the quiet shareholder, the private company owner, the family holding company, the investor who bought the asset decades ago, the person whose wealth compounds while everyone else is busy watching somebody else's lifestyle. And that's the uncomfortable truth about getting rich. You don't necessarily need to become famous. You need to own something valuable. Then you need to keep owning it. Because income can make you comfortable, but ownership can make you wealthy. And sometimes, the most powerful fortunes in the world belong to people you've never heard of.